Hello, and welcome to a new edition of Need to Know, a series of video interviews with companies who are shaping, creating, and innovating in the games industry today, and whose work will have a huge impact going forward into the future. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Ian Rice, Director General of the Games Rating Authority, or GRA, here to talk to us today about leveling up your games rating submissions and giving us some insider knowledge on tips for a smooth rating process. Before we get going, Ian, it's lovely to have you here with us today. Really appreciate you joining us. Would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about your background and what it is that you do at the GRA?
Sure, no problem. My name's Ian, as you said. Been at the Games Rating Authority now for around the past 15 years. I started as a video games examiner, so fortunate enough to have played and examined literally thousands of video games in the years that I've been here. I've also held positions as assistant director, director of operations before becoming director general in 2017.
Wonderful. No, that's really good to hear. You've seen it all from start to finish. So we should jump straight in then. When should we be thinking about getting a PEGI rating for our games? When should developers and publishers think about this?
So the main thing you need to consider when it comes to PEGI ratings is that if you're looking to get a game on one of the major consoles, so on Sony, Nintendo, or Microsoft, you have to have a PEGI rating before you can sell your game on there. Also in the UK, if you're looking to release your game physically, again, you have to have a PEGI rating before you can do that. So you need to make a submission to PEGI so we can classify your game.
And do you want to tell us a little bit more about how the PEGI rating sort of process works? Sort of, I guess from start to finish would be really
Sure.
helpful.
So all submissions initially start with a content declaration assessment, and within that, as a developer, you basically have to tell us about the various levels of violence, sex, bad language, drug use, etc., etc. So you're presented with kind of an expanding questionnaire. So if you say your game contains violence, you'll be asked who's the violence towards, and then how severe is the violence? Is it realistic, unrealistic? Are there any sort of special categories? So can you harm pedestrians, innocent civilians? Can you do acts of gross violence? So things like torture. You'll get a similar breakdown of questions for sexual content, drug use, through the whole selection of our content descriptors. And then as you're completing the questionnaire, if you say, yes, my game does contain realistic looking violence towards humans, you'll be asked to give a short description of that, how that appears in your game. And that's important when it comes to the next stage, because in addition to just asking the questions, we ask for video evidence. So you'll need to make a clip of all of your questionnaire answers, or a clip that contains evidence for all of your questionnaire answers. So we can see as a developer if you've understood the questionnaire, and we've got evidence for that content in the game. So typically you'd need to put together, between 30 minutes, 2 hours of gameplay footage, and then send us all the cutscenes in the game as well. So our examiners will then look through the video footage against your assessment answers to determine, have we got proof of all the content in your game. Then once they've watched all that footage, written notes on it all, they will then test the game itself. So we need a working copy of your build to test and play. The purpose of that, firstly, check your video was from the game that is being released, which is always handy. And secondly, to really try out things that weren't necessarily shown in the video. So what happens if I use a different weapon? For example, if I use an explosive rather than a pistol, are limbs going to start coming off? What happens if I shoot hostage in the corner? Can they be killed? Can I run down pedestrians in your driving game? So these are all things that will have an overall effect on the age rating. So we need to test out other avenues, and our examiners use their experience and gaming intuition to try and find out things that weren't necessarily shown in that video footage. So then they'll have the evidence from the game, the video, and your questionnaire. From that, we are able to determine what the correct age rating is. So once we've done that, send you your license, and then you can go ahead and proceed with your game.
Out of curiosity, Ian, how long does this sort of process tend to take? Is there a good average time, or can it vary?
Yeah, so there's two main rate tracks that we work towards. So ordinarily, we have the normal track 10 working days. So in between you submitting the game, giving us all of the materials that we need, and then playing the game. So that'd be 10 working days before you receive a license. There is a fast track procedure as well for developers that are, especially in a hurry to get their rating. Which obviously, if they come in, we'll prioritize those submissions. It still gives the examiners enough time to watch the video footage and play the game. It will just prioritize those against other submissions that we have.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. In terms of sort of common mistakes developers might make when submitting for a PEGI rating, would you be able to sort of talk through any sort of pitfalls for people to avoid, or trends that you're trying to encourage people not to
Yeah,
follow?
sure. I mean, we're quite lucky in there aren't regular mistakes that developers make, because we try, if we spot something, we try and add additional help text in the questions, or we issue more guidance through the newsletter to developers. We do frequent training with coders as well. I suppose the most common thing or slight pitfall developers do is they don't like dying in their own games, which can be slightly problematic for us if your character is, let's say, a human, and all of your enemies are fantasy monsters. The rating towards the violence towards the human character is more pertinent than violence towards fantastical characters. So we need to know what happens when your character dies. And if developers are playing the game really well and not dying because they want to show us lots of it, then that's not always the most helpful. So if you've got like a character jumping over spikes, or I think it was, not that they did this in their game, but in one of the Tomb Raider games, there was a zip wire, and if you failed, a spike went up through her neck. Whereas if you didn't play the game badly, we wouldn't have seen that. So it's just little things like that, just so we can see the full spectrum of content. Yeah, that's probably the most common one that we come up against.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I hadn't even considered some of that. That makes a lot of sense. So in terms of sort of making sure that their game gets the right rating for the first time, what more can developers do to ensure that it's all right?
Yeah, I mean, getting it right first time, make sure you send us video footage that really covers all of your answers. So if you've got different types of violence, we need to see all the different types of violence in it. Um, Make sure it's long enough that we can get a good feel for the game. So if the gameplay is quite varied, we might need a longer gameplay video than if, for example, it was just a straightforward, solitaire type game, or really basic gameplay that's repetitive. So it's giving us lots of quality video footage, being kind of diligent with your notes. So you're describing all the different scenes in the questionnaire, why you've ticked the answers. Sometimes what can happen is you see we developers write the same comment in multiple boxes against different questions. We need to know why you've ticked the different questions. So yeah, it's quality video footage. Check your game build before it comes to us. Make sure it definitely works, because again, that's something that can delay the examination procedure. Check for your scripts. So a relatively new requirement we have now at PEGI is we need your entire game script, and we'll run that through a piece of software that will search for mild bad language, strong bad language, sexual language, the whole spectrum. But you need to make sure that you fully know all the language that a game contains, so you can tick the appropriate questions in the questionnaire. Because if we have to go back to you as a developer, it's fine. We don't have a problem with that, but it's something that can make the process take a bit longer if we're waiting, to hear back from one another. So yeah, it's just make sure we've got all of the content up front, and you've given us lots of evidence to work with, basically.
Of course. And in terms of sort of consequences for, I mean, what happens if a game is misrated? I'm assuming in terms of receiving a rating that perhaps a developer wasn't anticipating. Perhaps is there a mechanism for challenging that or readdressing
Yeah.
that perhaps?
So there's two separate kind of sides to that. I guess the first one is, as a developer, if you've submitted a game, let's say for a PEGI 16, we've looked at the content and said, actually, do you know what? We think this meets our criteria at PEGI 18. There is an independent appeals process that you can go through as a developer. So there's a separate PEGI panel that will look at this, that are independent from us as administrators, the ones that are rating the games. They can look at your evidence, so the video footage, they'll look at the game, and obviously we'll highlight why we think it should be an 18, you'll say why it should be a 16, and they can look at that against the criteria and say, look, did the games rating authority apply the criteria correctly? And another perspective they can look at is, does the criteria still work? Has it been appropriate in this case? And sometimes if the criteria needs an amendment, they can say, do you know what, we side with the developers, but we're going to speak to the PEGI independent experts group and request new criteria for the games rating authority to be able to use going forward to classify consistently. So that's kind of how the appeals process works. Say if the appeals panel decide, actually, no, what, games rating authority got it right, we don't need any changes, then the rating sticks. The other side of it is they can decide, actually, the rating should be a 16, and that's the rating that we move forward with. The other side is if a developer fails to disclose content, let's say. So you had strong sexual expletives in your game, you didn't check yes to the question, it wasn't in your script, it wasn't in your submission video, and the game's gone out there, let's say, with a PEGI 12 on it when it should have been a 16, that's a slightly more complicated issue. There's two sides to it. Once it gets found, that then gets passed forward to PEGI Enforcement Committee. So PEGI can then impose sanctions on the developer, depending on the severity of the error. Also in the UK, it's a bit more complicated because if you've got a game out there with a 12 that should have been a 16, we, as the designated authority in the UK, would have to withdraw our certificate, which means that game then becomes an illegal product. So retailers can't sell it with a 12 on because we have to reissue a new certificate at 16. So very costly, very expensive for developers if we have to go down that road. Hence why we emphasize, please, please, please be diligent when you're doing your content declaration and examination materials, because if you fail to disclose something, the onus always sits with you as the developer for declaring that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. All the more reason to like you say, be thorough and check everything. Interesting. Okay. And in terms of sort of the criteria that you're talking about, I mean, have there been any sort of recent updates that might be worth mentioning? I mean, aside from you saying earlier about needing the entire game script, are there any other sort of aspects of the criteria that have been updated more recently? Perhaps,
Yeah.
I don't know,
So
in line with other sort of cultural trends taking
yeah,
place.
so we as the UK authority, we have a requirement to make sure that the PEGI ratings are in line with UK public expectations. So there's UK research that goes on. There's also research that takes place across Europe as well. So it's not just UK feeding into this. But we did some research not too long ago, and we were looking at the type of violence that you typically see in Star Wars movies and kind of superhero movies, where some of it can be realistic. So you're being punched and kicked, or the people on screen are being punched and kicked. And it's typically something that we would have categorized as realistic looking violence because the characters are reacting as you'd expect in real life to being hurt, rather than there being big flashes of light, over the top reactions, kind of thing you would see in Dragon Ball Z. So we showed the clips in in the research, and the general consensus was this type of content can or should be at PEGI 12 rather than PEGI 16. So we introduced a new criteria at PEGI 12, which covers realistic looking violence without blood or gore or obvious sight of harm, injury, or suffering towards humans. That will now, or that is now a PEGI 12. So previously, I said any realistic looking violence, even if there wasn't any blood, would have got a PEGI 16 as a default. Now you're starting to see those types of games getting a PEGI 12 rating, provided there aren't some other cutscenes in the game that contain stronger violence. The thing to note with the PEGI ratings is that there only needs to be one scene of a particular type of content for it to achieve an age rating. So if there's a stronger scene, if there's one scene where a character gets stabbed and there was blood, or they're being choked and they're in obvious pain, then we can't apply that 12 rating. But if it is all just kind of punching and kicking, there's no real sign of injury, harm, or any blood, then that can now be a PEGI 12.
That's really, really interesting. I didn't realize that was how that worked, really. Okay, well, fantastic. I think this has been really, really, really useful. I'm quite interested by an awful lot of things that you sort of covered there, Ian. That's really, really, really interesting. And so thank you so much for joining us today. There's an awful lot there to consider for developers and publishers, and submitting games for getting their ratings. So yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
No worries. And thank you as well to our audience today who's tuned in to catch this video. There's plenty of other need to know videos out there on our Ukie TV channel on YouTube. Thank you for enjoying this one, and more very soon. Thank you so much.